This is another program that's resulted from our joint educational initiative called Friday High Notes. It's a weekly program featuring fast facts, culture, cuisine, and connections between the great state of Oklahoma and the state of Israel. This idea came from the minds of our brilliant board members and friends, Dr. Dan Schwartz, whose program Echoing the Past you hopefully joined us for, and Lawrence or Larry H. Davis. Um, Larry is currently senior advisor and chief scientist for MAP or MAP Energy, a Palo Alto based energy development company where he has been associated since 1988. He holds a BA with high honors in archaeology and geology from Wesleyan University, an MS in geology, easy for me to say, from the University of Michigan, and an MBA from the University of Oklahoma. His accolades and accomplishments are many, and you can read his full bio on both of our websites. There's no point in trying to further tonight's featured photographer and lecturer, Larry Davis. So instead, I'm going to turn it over to him.
Oh, good evening, everybody. Let me share the screen right now. And okay, are you seeing the title page? Good. All righty, so here we go. So this past year, immediately pre-COVID, I actually returned back from Jerusalem on March 13th, so you know how close we caught it. I had the opportunity to co-lead a course at the University of Michigan on the geology of the Dead Sea. And it was, let me click over. And so what I'd like to do in the next 30 minutes or so is give you a combination slideshow of some places you may have never seen all around the Dead Sea in Israel, and also just a really brief, very brief introduction to the geology of the area. So, interesting photo here. You see here two PhD students at the University of Michigan, and the woman on the left, right, oops, sorry. And the woman on the left there, whose name is Maria Mustafa, is actually from Colombia, of Saudi descent, and is visiting Israel in the Earth Science Department of the University of Michigan through a scholarship from the Michigan Judaic Studies. Go figure, what a connection. So, and as the title suggests, we wanted to both introduce the geology, but also the cultural evolution, i.e. archaeology of the area to the Michigan students who joined me. So I was very fortunate. We had as our field trip leader, Dr. Monty Stein of the Hebrew University Institute of Earth Sciences, an absolutely amazing geoscientist, and he provided input and knowledge to our trip that I never could have contributed. So we were very fortunate in that way. So we're going to start off, and I promised to minimize the geology here, but this was a geology field trip. And the first few slides are going to look at pictures from Tel Bental right here. And then we're going to go up to Birkat Ram Mar. And right in this area, and what I like to say to everyone, we're in the Golan Heights right here. And the Golan Heights is this really amazing volcanic field. And it's part of a volcanic field from the Arabian Shield right here that continues down into Saudi Arabia. And what is really amazing, and hopefully you can see it, that there is a lineation of volcanic structures, these little heavy red, darker red dots right along here that mark a volcanic line or a line of volcanoes. So here we are, and I don't know if any of you have ever actually considered or thought about it, but the Golan Heights in northern Israel is a land of volcanoes. You can clearly see the volcanic shape here, and you can see even more beautiful volcanic structures in the distance. When I was looking at these slides, I said, except for the greenness, I could be in New Mexico, Northeast New Mexico. So just a lovely little area. And it's interesting because the scientists at Hebrew University have done a lot to date these volcanoes, and most of this volcanic activity that we see in this area is actually quite recent. It's about 25 to 50 million years ago. So, and of course, this being a geology field trip, I had to add the one slide just to emphasize that while the vast majority, maybe every other tourist to Israel goes to look at archaeological remains, goes to look at churches, goes to go shopping, go through souks, that type of thing. Our group here is looking at rocks, and that's what makes geology the most fun of all sciences. Now, what I really wanted to point out is how central Israel is to all locations. Just as just a funny sign, but what's really, if you've not been up to Har Bental, Mount Bental, which actually has a lookout station on it, there's this amazing amount of junk art sculptures along the way. It's a great place to go. And this was actually my second visit there. Very interesting. So after that, we went up north, and this is a lake right near the Syrian-Lebanon border. And the reason we went here is that this lake body has been cored. And in the sediments that were taken from the cores of this lake has enabled the scientists at Hebrew University and elsewhere to reconstruct the last 15,000 years of climatic environmental history for this area. And it's very interesting, and I'll comment a little more on that later. Also, as we think about it, I also wanted to mention that the Dead Sea transform fault system, that is, and I'll talk a little bit more about that also in the near future, but essentially the Golan Heights and the eastern side of the Dead Sea system, Jordan River system, is geologically amazingly different from the western side, because on the western side, you could actually see Mount Hermon, and that's right here. And it's, I know some of you may have seen this, but it's always interesting to note that there's snow in Israel. Very, very cool. And the rocks on Mount Hermon are Jurassic in age, which, think about things like Jurassic Park, much older than the much more recent volcanics on the eastern side. And so amazing geological differences between both sides of the Dead Sea. And of course, one of the things that we did have to introduce to our students was the typical Israeli lunch, and they loved it. So, transform faults. It's sort of funny. This is the type of thing that just warms the cockles of every geologist's heart. I don't know what it will do for any of you guys. But anyway, what I wanted to show here, and hopefully I can do it a little bit of justice, is that down here, the Red Sea is actually a rift zone where the Arabian plate to the west and the African plate to the east are actually pulling apart. Think of that as the same thing as might be happening in the mid-oceanic rifts in the Atlantic, or in Oklahoma, an actual analogy to this type of rift valley would be the Anadarko Basin of western Oklahoma. And because of compressional problems that associate as two different land masses pull apart, two plates pull apart, something has to give. There are stresses that are formed. And the result of those stresses is a transform fault system that you see in this lineation right here. And this transform fault system is what in fact gives rise to the Dead Sea basins. And also it gives rise to the valleys that form the Jordan River. So here we have a view of the Jordan River in this area. And the reason the Jordan River sits where it does is that it is in the Dead Sea basins, the transform fault system of the Dead Sea basin. And we're going to talk, and this is one of the things that we spent a lot of time exploring on our field trip. And transform faults have the nasty habit of having a lot of associated tectonic action. And in this case, the Crusaders actually built a fortress right on the transform fault, which in this case is showing a strike slip type of motion. And think of the San Andreas fault, where this side of the fault is moving north and this side is moving south. And the unfortunate thing about this is that this fault decided to be active during the use, well, it sort of ended the use of this fortress. So we see here actual archaeological evidence of the eruptions, the disruptions, the seismic activity caused by the fault. And we have really good records that we know that there was approximately 1/2 meter of displacement along this fault in 1202. And there was another similar amount of movement along this fault in 1759. And just fascinating to see how you can actually see the actions of these faults in historical buildings. And that leads to one of the interesting items that is not talked to about that much, but this Israel, cities like Jerusalem, and all of these areas that sit in and along the Dead Sea are in an extremely seismically active area, which means living in Israel is a lot like living in California. Okay, so during this field trip, because everyone was on student budgets, we got to stay at various kibbutzim. This is Kibbutz Gadol, which I was really excited about. I said to myself, no way, they've already named a kibbutz for Wonder Woman? Oh, well, anyway, it turned out that wasn't the case, as you well know, but just was an amazing place to stay. I would recommend it if you're ever in this area and just wanting to do some nice tourism and relax and have a very nice place to stay in an incredibly wonderful area at low cost. A great opportunity. And I just looked at that star and I said, that reminds me of something, but I really couldn't place it. Okay. So that was our first day. But I should mention that our students arrived the day previously around midnight. So they had 12 hours of geology thrown at them in after about 5 hours of sleep. So it was interesting. And then the second day, and when you go on these geologic field trips, there is no rest. We decided to view the area from Lake Kinneret, AKA the Sea of Galilee, down to the top of the Dead Sea. And we're going to show stops that occurred right here at this and down here by the Dead Sea. So this is interesting. This is the only time in my many years of travel on geological field trips that we actually had a geologic lecture in a cemetery. Doesn't happen that often. But for me, this was a very interesting place to have a lecture because this is the Kinneret Cemetery. And this cemetery literally houses the pantheon of labor Zionists, the graves of very famous labor Zionists, including Moses Hess, Nachman Sirkan, and also included here is the grave of Naomi Shemer. And she is the composer and singer of Jerusalem of Gold. So a very interesting place to have a geologic study. And of course, what we were in fact studying in this area was the sedimentary record of the various previous manifestations of the Lake Kinneret. But when you're in Israel, you have to have shashuka. And so for the first time, the vast majority of the students had their first shashuka right after visiting the cemetery. We next went down, we went to the Kochav HaYarden Crusader Fortress. Now, why would we go to a Crusader fortress? Well, there are a couple of reasons we wanted to do this. The first is that the fortress itself is all constructed of basalt, that is the rock that comes from this volcanic area. The second is that there are two major basalt flows. There's a basalt flow that the fortress actually sits upon, and that is dated to about 5.3 million years ago. And then I'm sorry there. And at the basement of the tell that the fortress sits on is another basalt flow that's dated to about 10 million years ago. And in between that are a bunch of lacustrine sediments that belong to what is referred to as Lake Bira. And these lacustrine sediments represent a 5 million year earlier history for Lake Kinneret. And the sediments of Lake Bira are the basic rock that forms the areas of the Yisrael Valley, the Jordan Valley, in much of northern Israel. So if you look at right in here and in here, all this whole area in the green, that gives you a feel of what 5 to 10 million years ago the extent of the Sea of Galilee might be. Again, only a geologist gets excited by this type of stuff. And the other thing that we really liked about being at Kochav HaYardon is you get an amazing commanding view of the what we call, these are referred to as pull apart basins that exist in this transform fault system of the Dead Sea. And you really get a good feel of the geology here. Here we are on the western side. Here you can see the pull apart basin of the transform fault system. And there you're looking over onto the Jordan side. Now, one of the things that's very interesting is that geologists, when they have a basin like this, often think about, wonder if there is any oil or gas in it. So I happened to be in Colorado visiting a friend of mine, and I was talking to her about this field trip that we were about to do. And she says, well, you have to meet my friend. She was a Holocaust survivor who was one of the very earliest women geologists at the University of Texas. And in the 1950s, wrote her master's thesis on the petroleum potential of the Dead Sea transform system of this part of the world. And I feel really honored in that I have an actual copy of her original hand-typed thesis. And so I could show the students and say, okay, here is what a Holocaust survivor who in the 1950s going to the University of Texas, which would obviously make English her second or third language, wrote. And so I just wanted to make you feel a little bit, what your capabilities really are. So as we went further south, we began to look at the more recent lake sediments of the Dead Sea area. And these are the sediments of the late Pleistocene, better known as the glacial ages, started about 2 million years ago, through the Holocene. And the Holocene, basically, geologically, is what we refer to as the last 10,000 years or so, or the time period of the current interglacial area. Now, obviously, some of us are sitting there going, wow, almost wish we could start another glacial period. It might cure the climatic change that we're having, but oh well, not going to happen. And so these sediments that you see here are two sediments of two formations, and the top one being the Lisan formation. And much of what this part of Israel's landscape is composed of are, in fact, the sediments of the more recent manifestations of the Dead Sea. And finally, here's an interesting stop that we made for yet one more geological lecture, because it turns out there is a Roman pier that is through this crater hole right here that gives us a really good point of the a marker for the elevation of the Dead Sea 2,000 years ago. And so if the title talks about the dying of the Dead Sea, you can get a feel for the degree that the Dead Sea has receded over the past 2,000 odd years. By the way, this restaurant here was a very popular Jordanian restaurant that existed pretty much between the Israeli War of Independence through the Six-Day War. And unfortunately, it sits like this now, but there's some actual amazing graffiti, including, I don't know if you can see right here, but along the top here, an Israeli soldier actually painted a mural of what the landscape was at that time period. So very interesting place. And again, one of those stops that the average tourist to Israel does not get to go or visit. And okay, day 3. So we're continuing south along our tour of the Dead Sea. And in this area, we're at the southernmost portion of the Dead Sea, where we're going to today visit Masada and also look at some additional very interesting geology associated with the more modern pull-apart basins of the Dead Sea transform system. So from Masada, yet another view of a pull-apart basin. You can see it right here. There's Jordan over here, and here we are on Masada, one of those interesting places we took the students, which hopefully every visitor to Israel gets to see. And I apologize because I realized I look at my other screen to look at the map and I'm not looking at you. So my apologies. But today we're going to look at, we're both at Masada right here, and you can see the extent of the basin on this geologic map. By the way, these pretty colorful maps I've been showing, for those of you not familiar with them, are called geologic maps. They show the lithology, specifically the formations that are expressed on the surface of the earth. And they're really fun because they're so colorful. I think they would make great wallpaper personally. And then we're also going to go down to right down here to visit the only active salt diapir in the world that you can go and visit. So, in fact, here we are. So I would like to everyone, this is one of my favorite parts of the entire trip. I don't know if it's because I was with a bunch of geologists, or more specifically, I was with an Israeli geologist. But as we approached this cave location here, there was very clearly a sign that said, and I wasn't totally sure about the Arabic or Hebrew translation, but this part, danger, keep out, do not enter, which was repeated 3 more times, actually spoke to me. And as I asked my friend Mati, Dr. Stein, should we be going this? He says, no Israeli follows any laws. We're going inside. So we did. And inside, this is actually an active salt diapir, i.e., this is a plume of salt that is actively rising and is at the surface of the earth right now. It's actually rising between 5 and 11 millimeters per year currently. And clearly this is a mine and has been mined in the past. And if you can see here, yes, this is halite or salt. And this is the only place on the face of the earth that you can actually go into a salt diapir, which is really very, very cool. And I will also say that some of the structures associated with this salt diapir on the side of the road have actually been interpreted as where Sodom was actually turned into a pillar of salt. So I can actually offer you two explanations as to why this salt is here. So, as these are all the sediments, again, of the white, oops, oh man, my mouse is. These white sediments right here are the lacustrine, i.e. lake sediments of the Licon Formation or of the current Dead Sea. And it's really interesting on a whole variety of notes. And I'll try to explain those a little bit more. And we are right here, basically on the periphery of Masada. And as our students were walking up these cliffs, this is what geologists love to do, dawned on me, I was just wondering if all the students had in fact signed their liability waivers. Fortunately, we didn't lose any. But I don't know if you can see this, and there's two different formations right here. There's this brown formation that you see here, which is one geologic formation, which goes to the top of this is about, I think, 72 or 74,000 years ago. And then there's this other formation right here, which is topped here by a couple gypsum beds, which goes from about 74,000 years ago to about 15,000 years ago. And keep that in mind, because that's interesting, because these rocks that are so far above current ground level, current Dead Sea level, were actually buried only 15,000 years ago. They were deposited 15,000 years ago under an ancestral form of the Dead Sea. And here we go. So right here, the Massif that Masada's on, this whole area right here is within the ancestral Dead Sea. And all these deposits you see here are in fact the sediments that were deposited under the Dead Sea. So just imagine, if you will, that these sediments right here we've done we haven't done, but the scientists, the geologists at Hebrew University and elsewhere have dated these to 14,000 years ago, and that above these sediments actually sat the Dead Sea. So if you begin to consider that, you can see that the Dead Sea, since 14,000 years ago, has, say the top of the sea was somewhere in here, has dropped that far and continues to be receding. Pretty interesting. But the other thing I really want everyone to appreciate, this is really cool, because this is where geologists are so instrumental in our knowledge of paleoclimatic, paleo-environmental reconstruction, that all of these striations you see here are sediments that within them contain a wealth of information of what the Earth's environment was like over the last, if you start right here, over the last 70 to 14,000 years ago. We call these structures varves, and each one of these striations, I don't know if you can see them, but if you see the bandings, each one of those bandings actually represents 1 year's sedimentary input into the ancestral Dead Sea. And what happens is the reason they form is that you get dust storms that come from North Africa that blow across Israel in the past and would fall into the ancestral Dead Sea and form a layer. And as we analyze those, the amount of, and they've actually gone through, you can see a 10 shekel piece here for scale, they've actually gone through and have made microscope slides of the entire length of these sedimentary bodies, so they can precisely measure the nature of each varv. And from these varvs, we get an indication of how much rainfall there was during that time period of that year. We get information upon what might have been the associated temperature during that year. We get information on what was in fact so we basically are reconstructing wet periods and dry periods, and we understand that the wet periods are associated with rises in the Dead Sea, and dry periods are associated with drops in the Dead Sea. Now, of course, in our current time period of the Holocene age, and some geologists are now referring to our time right now as the Anthropocene age because of the massive amount of human interaction to shaping our environment, that we see that the association of that additional activity has caused yet additional dropping of the Dead Sea. But we know this graph right here, which if you look at this is the relative lake level. So since this is right now, you can see the lake level is low until about 14,000 years ago. And of course, this corresponds 14,000 years ago, roughly to the end of the last glacial age. And then before that period, this is the relative elevation of the lake. And you can see actually over the time period how finely tuned we have. We can see there were periods that were much wetter to about 30,000 years ago, dry periods, wet periods, dry periods. And so we actually get this really amazing reconstruction of the environment of the Dead Sea area, which we've been able to correlate to similar studies throughout Europe and other areas. So this is this has been calibrated elsewhere in the world too. Now, putting on my archaeology hat and my anthropology hat, you have to then sit there and think about, well, this whole period, and by the way, I failed to mention that in many ways, the Red Sea Rift Zone is a continuation of the Rift Zone that goes all the way into Africa and informs, among other things, Olduvai Gorge. And in fact, we know there's been human occupation of this area for tens of thousands of years. There are definitely Paleolithic archaeological sites in Israel, none of which we visited here. But we now can understand that this climatic record that we have here helps us to actually understand the environment that early hominids and later Paleolithic cultures would have existed in the past. So really, really amazingly great stuff. And of course, when you're in a hypersaline lake, this is what you do. So I'm now going to see how bad I'm doing on time because I'm notoriously, I'm way over. I apologize. Can I keep going? I have just a few more. Okay. One last area that we went into, which is here we are in the transform fault system. So we just wanted to go here. It's not exactly in the Dead Sea, but this is the Ramon crater. And if you haven't been here, this is a great place. This is the Ramon crater is the largest known completely enclosed crater structure of its kind in the world. Most craters you think of as being the result of meteor impact or something along those lines. Well, it turns out that the Ramon crater is actually an erosional feature. It's just that there were softer rocks in the center here, and they were differentially eroded away as the surrounding rocks were rising, and you get this amazing enclosed structure, which is just absolutely beautiful. And because we were cutting away into older rocks here, this is one place in Israel that you can actually look at rocks that date back as much as 200 million years. Another really, really amazing geologic site in Israel. And the area is just beautiful. This is actually in the area of Ramon crater. And there you can see these columnar structures right here. And when most people see them, they might be reminded of something like the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland or areas like that. And of course, those are basaltic structures. But here, this is somewhat unique in that these are actually columnar structures that are formed from sandstone. So another uniquely, not completely unique, but a semi-unique Israeli geologic feature in a really beautiful place. And this is a beautiful place to get away from it and to hike and see all the beauty. We stayed this night at Kibbutz Keturah, which is an amazing, amazing kibbutz. And a couple interesting things about it is this date palm you see is an amazing date palm. You may have heard about it on NPR, but this date palm was actually germinated from seeds that were found at Masada and date 2,000 years ago. And this is amazing in that, okay, so you need both a male and female date palm in order for them to actually be able to produce fruit. And in this case, we only had one, but in the Bible, the Judean date, the dates of Judea from the Judean date palm are mentioned all over. And judging upon the reviews they received during that biblical time period, they must be superior to all current dates. And what's very exciting is very recently they've germinated the opposite sex date palm. And so in the future, we might be able to actually, somebody might be able to actually have Judean dates. It's sort of like Jurassic Park with date palms. And I also Keturah, interestingly, at the time, this was the largest solar field, 40 megawatt field in Israel. But even neater is this red algae plant, where they are actually concentrating a substance that's found in red algae called astaxanthin, if I pronounce that right. And it is one of the strongest known natural antioxidants in the world and is heavily used in cosmetics. And while we are at Camp Keturah, this had just been sold to a major corporation for millions and millions of dollars. So every member of the kibbutz had become, and this is a socialist kibbutz, had become very wealthy. Finally, on our last day, we went to Mount Timnah. Now, Mount Timnah is this little structure that you see right here. And this is actually basically, the earliest, very early, very old aged basaltic intrusive that has associated copper mineralization. And you can see that this is located right along the Dead Sea transform. You can see this intrusive very clearly in this area right here for the discoloration of the ground. And what's so amazing about this is these are the early copper deposits that were so instrumental to creating the earliest Neolithic Bronze Age tools that are from these time periods. And what you can see here, and it's another just beautiful area, and this is what geologists do when they're being lectured to, I guess all students do that, is that when you go through the valley, you can actually see ancient workshops like here, where these were actually ancient copper workshops where they were smelting copper and creating copper tools. Really fascinating. And the interesting thing is that the most recent dating of these workshops is between the 11th and 9th century BCE, which puts them basically at the time of David and/or Solomon. So really neat. And this is another area that I don't know how many tourists go to. As you can see, there's not a lot in the visiting on this day, but incredible geology. And again, right along the Dead Sea transform fault system. And also right here are these amazing structures that these are called Solomon Pillars, and just beautiful desert landscapes. And on that note, I will end my discussion of the geology of the Dead Sea, and certainly open for any questions. And let me.
If you'd like to ask any questions, I know sometimes it's easier to do it in the chat box. You're welcome to do that, or to unmute yourself and ask Larry yourself.
This is Donna. The volcanoes that you showed in northern Israel, are those inactive volcanoes?
So
I don't know the difference. I mean, I do know an active one, but I don't know what makes one active.
The answer is they're very recent, and in geologic scale of time, inactive and active has a different meaning. So you have to consider that, yeah, there can be, there's the potential for active volcanism sometime in the future, who knows, is real, but there's nothing currently erupting along those lines.
Thank you.
Ah.
What about kind of fossils? I as a kid, I always loved fossils. What are some of the things you may have found that are fossils?
So in the Ramon crater, there is actually a very famous fossil locality called the Ammonite Wall. And those are Cretaceous age fossils, and quite frankly, are the same basic fossils or same time period of some of the fossils that we find located along Lake Texoma. So there are fossil localities, but it was not particularly what we were looking at. Much of what we were doing was really emphasized on paleoclimatic reconstruction.
Larry, I'm not sure if you see the question. Barbara's asking, how much of the lowering of the dead is due to change, and how much is due to normal passage of time? And do we know? So
the answer is, so there's, I think to answer the question, we have to differentiate between that normal climatic change. Remember that on any geologic time scale, right now we are in an interglacial period that not that long ago, the University of Michigan was under an ice sheet 14,000 years ago. So there has, as the glaciers receded, that clearly was tied to the tremendous lowering of the Dead Sea. So that's climatic change, but that's natural climatic change. I think what the question is now is that have we accelerated the lowering of the Dead Sea? And yes, we have, because of us just pulling water out of the Dead Sea for manufacturing processes, etc. There are projects right now where literally they're building pipelines to pump water in to the Dead Sea to basically help it to stem the lowering. So, I think Rabbi Goldman writes, was there any impact on the students? And of course, being, so I would say that unmistakably, most Americans that have never come to Israel, and many Americans, so understand, and just as an observation, that Michigan, in fact, has a very large Arab community. And so there is a popular perception of what Israel might be like. And I think when you're really there, that yes, their image of the country definitely changed. They had a great time. I should say I did not go into this, but we followed this with a visit to Jordan, which was wonderful in its own part, but it was definitely, it was very interesting to them to be able to contrast. I think for the most part, they were, because we were in the parts of Israel that were very modern and are also very natural, they were amazed by how modern, how industrial, and how technologically advanced Israel was, and how free it is. Any other thoughts or questions? Did I miss any? I don't think so.
You got them. Well, I know we're getting close to time. So Larry, I just want to thank you again for taking the time to share this with us. I mean, incredibly fascinating things that I had no idea about. You know, we're thrilled that you were able to share your work with us. And then thank you all for taking the time to join us. And yeah, it was a wonderful time. Larry, you left us with a lot of information that I guarantee we did not know.
I apologize that it was, unfortunately, this was a geology field trip, and I sort of, it didn't dawn on me that everybody here weren't PhD students until about an hour ago. So.
Well, thank you, everyone. I will be sending a recording video if you'd like to share it with anyone else. And to Hillel, OKIE will all on our social media. So thank you for joining us, and everyone stay warm and safe and in good spirits.
Thank you all.